right. It's been over a year now since this war in Ukraine began. By most estimates, the casualty count running into tens of thousands. And what seems to be interesting is there doesn't seem to be an end in sight, both from the Ukrainian side or from the Russian side, to talk about how this conflict may progress over the summer months, particularly because there is some chatter about a Ukrainian counteroffensive, a Russian offensive, so on and so forth. And of course, the stories that we've been hearing in the days leading up to today. Joining us now is one of the foremost and most erudite foreign policy scholars in the world, and somebody who has a very keen eye on the trajectory of this war and how it's been progressing from even before it began. Professor John Mearsheimer is the head of Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor.
My pleasure to be here.
So let's start with where we are today. It's been over a year since this war began. Were you expecting it to last this long? And what is your assessment of where things stand today?
Well, I figured that it would be a long war. And of course, it's proven to be a long war, given that it's gone on now for well over a year. I think basically what happened was that in 2022, the Ukrainians did quite well for themselves. And there was a lot of optimism in the West that the Ukrainians would ultimately capture all of the territory that they had lost and deliver a significant defeat to the Russians. But I think things have changed in 2023, largely as a result of the Russians mobilizing all sorts of forces, and also the fact that the Russians, because of their advantage in artillery, have killed many more Ukrainians than Ukrainians have killed Russians. So the balance, in a very important way, in 2023 has shifted towards the Russians. And I think at this particular juncture, and I think it's true moving forward, I think the Russians have a significant advantage over the Ukrainians.
The last time we spoke, which was a few months ago, you said the trajectory of this war is going in the way of the Korean War or the Russia-Georgia conflict, which, as you described it, were frozen conflicts. Is there anything that's happened in the last few weeks and months that leads you to believe that this is not going the way of a frozen conflict?
No, I think that whether or not you have a frozen conflict or a meaningful peace settlement is a function of whether or not there is a deal that can be worked out between the two sides. And I've long argued that there is no meaningful peace agreement that the two sides would agree to. And there are two thorny issues, two intractable issues, to be honest, that are at play here. One is the territorial issue, and the other is the issue of neutrality. With regard to territory, for understandable reasons, the Ukrainians want all their territory back. But the Russians have already annexed the Crimea and 4 Ukrainian oblasts, and they have made it unequivocally clear that they're not giving that territory back. So there's no resolution of the territorial problem. Then there's the issue of neutrality. Again, for understandable reasons, the Ukrainians want a security guarantee. And the only country or institution that can give them that security guarantee is NATO. But the Russians insist that Ukraine has to be neutral and has to cut its ties with NATO. Again, how do you square that circle? And the answer is you don't. So in effect, there's no deal here. You can't have a meaningful peace agreement, and the best you can hope for is a frozen conflict.
So I want to talk a little bit about this Ukrainian counteroffensive that's being talked about. Zelensky has been going around world capitals talking about how the counteroffensive has already started. This chatter of equipping the Ukrainians with F-16 fighter jets. How do you see this conflict, particularly as we get into the summer months? And this was the time that Ukraine sort of pushed back last year as well, same time last year. How do you see it playing out over the next, let's say, 4 or 5 months?
Well, there's no question that the Ukrainian government is under tremendous pressure from the West to launch a counteroffensive and to demonstrate that it has significant offensive capability and that there's some reasonable chance that they can take back that territory from the Russians that they have lost. The Ukrainians, however, understand, given what's happened on the battlefield in recent months, and given the shift in the balance of power that's taken place in favor of the Russians, that it would be very foolish to launch a major offensive now. Because once the Ukrainian forces come up out of their trenches, up out of the ground, and they're moving forward in the open, they're vulnerable to all of that Russian artillery and that Russian air power. And the Russians will inflict massive casualties on them. So what you see here is that the Ukrainians have been very hesitant to launch a major offensive against those heavily defended Russian positions. However, on Sunday, this past Sunday, the Ukrainians began to launch small-scale offensives, and they've been doing that for the past few days. The end result, however, is that the Russians have been inflicting massive casualties on them. There's a huge casualty imbalance here between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and it's because the firepower balance is so decisively in favor of the Russians at this point in time. So we're in a situation now where the Ukrainians are not in a position to launch an offensive like they were last year. Remember what I said at the beginning of the program. The Ukrainians were in quite good shape in 2022, but now in 2023, the balance has shifted against them. And I think that moving forward, what you're going to see is that the balance is going to continually favor the Russians, and the Russians are going to make more and more advances on the ground.
So I also want to talk about one of the things that's happened recently in the last few days, this dam that was attacked, and now we're seeing, parts of Kherson being flooded. There's chatter about how this could potentially put in danger the nuclear reactors around there. The Ukrainians, of course, have straight away blamed Russia for this blasting this dam. Russia has denied it. What does this indicate to you? Is there a sense of desperation from both sides? Because I haven't quite seen something like this, blasting a dam and putting cities under flood waters in some time.
Let me just say, I don't know who did it, and I've read extensively on the issue, and you can make an argument that there were some reasons for the Ukrainians to do it and some reasons for the Russians to do it. So through pure deduction, it's hard to say who did it or who is likely to have done it. I don't see how either side gains any major military advantage from blowing up this dam. So I don't think that it's going to have much effect on the course of the battle. But what it illustrates to me is what a total disaster this war is for Ukraine. I argued before the war started that the United States and its allies should go to great lengths to prevent this war, in large part because once it started, the Russians would go to great lengths to wreck Ukraine, to turn it into a dysfunctional rump state. And if you look at what's happening to Ukraine today, it's just absolutely horrible. It's an utter disaster. And it just gets worse and worse as the war escalates. And by the way, the dam coming unglued is evidence of escalation at play. We should expect more events of this sort moving forward. But as to who did it and why they did it, it's just not clear at all.
I also want to talk to you a little bit about this story around the Nord Stream pipelines, which were blasted away last year. Now there is new reporting from the Washington Post, which seems to suggest that the Biden administration, through its intelligence agencies, was in the loop that pro-Ukraine groups were going to carry this out. This is in addition to the story that came out a few months ago, which suggested that contrary to what some journalists like Mr. Seymour Hersh have been reporting, that U.S. military operations groups or special operations groups that carried this out. but this was pro-Ukrainian groups who were behind that. I'm just curious to know what you think of this whole mystery around who blew up the Nord Stream pipelines.
Well, as you point out, there are really two stories that are floating around now. One is identified with Cy Hirsch, and that's the argument that the Americans did it. And Cy Hirsch, who talked to people on the inside, seemed to have lots of hard evidence from talking to insiders that the Americans did it. Then a number of people began to make the argument, and you saw this in news outlets in both the United States and Germany, and legitimate places like the New York Times, making the case that it was not the United States, that it was either Ukrainian government, Ukrainian groups that were operating independently of the Ukrainian government or acting in tandem with the Ukrainian government. And the Seymour Hersh response to that is that this is basically a disinformation campaign to hide the fact that the Americans did it. People on the other side say that's not true at all. The Americans didn't do it. The Ukrainians did it. Where the truth lies is very hard to say at this point in time, just like it's very hard to say who's responsible for blowing up the dam the other day. We need hard evidence to make a decisive conclusion one way or the other. And at this point, we don't have much evidence on either side. So I think we're just going to have to wait a while, maybe a long time, to figure out exactly what happened here.
So assuming that, neither side has a significant advantage to the extent that they can force an outcome in this war over the next few months, and if this war is going to continue into the 2024 U.S. presidential cycle, what sort of domestic impact do you think that could potentially have? And it looks like it's going to be Biden on the side of the Democrats and Trump on the side of the Republicans. Will this war, this continuing war, have a fallout domestically on the presidential cycle?
Well, my guess is that what's going to happen here is that the Russians are going to make more and more gains over the next year. And that going into the 2024 election, it will look like the Russians are on the verge of some kind of victory, or maybe have achieved some kind of victory by then. And this will cause all sorts of problems for President Biden, because the Republicans will criticize him for not backing the Ukrainians with enough military force. Biden has made, in my opinion, a big mistake making the claim that the Ukrainians would win and that we would back them until they did win. Because if the Russians end up winning, or events on the battlefield play out in a way that looks like the Russians won, then Joe Biden ends up with a black eye. And this is not good going into the election. And of course, the Republicans will go to great lengths to take advantage of that situation to make it look like Biden was weak and he didn't do what was necessary to help the Ukrainians, after he said that he was going to help the Ukrainians achieve their goals on the battlefield. So I think moving forward, what's happening in Ukraine is bad news for the Biden administration.
Just the last couple of questions, just in terms of, if, as you say, Russia is going to gain further and further, and it's going to be Russia, maybe at the end of 6 months, maybe at the end of this summer, that Russia is in a better position to claim victory, or is nearer to victory than Ukraine is. How does both Ukraine and the West, America included, deal with that? Because for Ukraine, as Zelensky keeps saying, has kept saying from day one, this is almost like an existential crisis for them. If they lose this war, Ukraine as a country ceases to exist. So how do you square that? And B, for the West, that is America, its European partners, with NATO, can they brook a Russian victory?
Well, I mean, the question is, how do we get from the fighting that's now taking place to a frozen conflict? Because as I said, there's no meaningful peace agreement here. The question is, when do you get to a frozen conflict? I think your comments make it clear that just to get to a frozen conflict is going to be difficult because the Ukrainians are going to continue to fight, and the West has a profound interest in continuing to back the Ukrainians to make sure the Russians don't win a big victory. The Russians, on the other hand, have an incentive to win a big victory. So it's hard to see this war coming to an end, which means turning into a frozen conflict anytime soon. But once it turns into a frozen conflict, it's probably not going to remain a frozen conflict for that long, again, for all the reasons that you laid out. The Ukrainians and the West will have a vested interest in building up the Ukrainian military to where it can go back on the offensive and give the Russians all sorts of problems on the battlefield and hopefully take back more Ukrainian territory that's been lost to the Russians. So you see, getting to a frozen conflict will not be easy, and then maintaining a frozen conflict once you get there won't be easy. All of this is to say, this situation, this disastrous situation, is likely to continue for as far as the eye can see, because we have no meaningful peace agreement on the horizon.
And one final word, what is the impact of this conflict, the fallout of this conflict on global relations between various powers, particularly in the context of, the upcoming G20 meeting, which India is hosting? We had a joint statement in the last G20, which Indonesia had hosted. There again, negotiations went on for a number of hours, and finally they thrashed through an agreement which had a very minimal reference to Ukraine and Russia and the conflict, but nonetheless, they did manage to get a joint statement. How has this conflict divided the world? Not just, America and its allies on the one side, and perhaps Russia and China on the other, but even, countries who don't necessarily have a stake directly in what's going on in between Russia and Ukraine.
Well, I think that there is no question that once you get outside of the West, and this would include countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia, I include them in the West. Once you get outside of the West, most countries are quite sympathetic to the Russian side and not to the Western side. And this is evident in India's attitude towards the conflict. The Americans, for understandable reasons, want the Indians to join forces with the West and go after the Russians hammer and tong. The Indians are not buying that argument at all. And I think for smart reasons on the part of India. I think most Indians understand that it was the West that provoked this conflict, and that siding with Ukraine and the West is not a smart policy at this point in time. So the West has this real problem that once you get outside of the West, which includes over half of the people on the planet, you find that most people in that world sympathize with Russia, not with the West. And this causes real problems. And of course, the United States will continue to put pressure on India to side with the West. But my sense is that that won't happen. All
right, Professor John Mearsheimer, as always, a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for speaking up.
You're welcome.
Thank you.